All right, Tanya.
Thank you so much, Ariana, for convening us. Hi, folks. It's really great to see so many folks in the room, some of whom I know are really expert on these issues, so I hope that you can share your experiences. My name is Tanya Paperny. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and many, many months ago, potentially almost a year ago, I sent an email to a listserv, the Radical Communicators Network, and sort of asked if people wanted to talk about the ethics of storytelling, and there was an overwhelming response. And given the number of people in the room today, I get the sense that this is something that's really on people's minds, which is great. So let me tell you a little bit about why this feels important now, why we're here. So first and foremost, humans are wired for stories evolutionarily, scientifically. We seek stories to socialize. Telling stories is a way to socialize, build community. It's a way to escape from challenging times. It is a way to build empathy with experiences that one does not share. It's been demonstrated that it also helps remember things. You're more likely to remember something if it is told in a story form. And it makes connection and meaning with other people through themes and shared life experiences. Why now? There's really an increasing interest in what's called the narrative change approach, and I'm not going to go too deeply into it. There's lots of things you can read online about it, including an organization called Narrative Initiative, led by Rinku Sen. But I encourage folks to look into it if you're not already familiar. There's some smart people on the line who know a lot more about it than me. But the idea is that we actually, on the left, need to do culture change and do really deep values work. And narrative are the ideas and themes that connect across stories and how we make sense of the world. And the right wing and conservatives have done this quite well and with a lot more money than the left. So that's part of why there's need to be investment in this. With social media and the internet, it's become easier than ever to get people to submit, collect, and share stories. But with that also comes risk, right, around people's content, lives being shared without their consent, how those stories get used, reposted without credit, so many dynamics. So that's really where we're going to dig into today, is the how and the what of storytelling, making sure that we are considering how our storytelling work, whether in social change, political campaigns, issue campaigns, fundraising, nonprofit advocacy, grassroots work, our own personal advocacy, is considerate of liberation, justice, sharing of power, fairness, equity, things like that. This session is not about journalism or a journalistic approach. Myself and a number of us, Fariha, I know for sure, have a journalism background and do reporting, and we will bring some of those tips and tools into the room. We'll borrow from journalism, but this session is not targeted to people primarily doing storytelling through traditional journalism. So let me tell you just a little bit about the folks who will be presenting today. I'm not going to read their biographies. Those were shared around by Ariana, I believe, beforehand. And when we send out resources afterwards, you can take a look at them more closely. But just to give you a sense of who we are, what we bring, and what we're going to be talking about today. Oops. Sorry. So I'll start with Frederic Adou. Frederic is based in West Africa in Côte d'Ivoire. He does community work for businesses and nonprofits that are doing community impact. He brings a lot of the audiovisual work to the table. He's going to be specifically talking to us about audio and film today. And he does a lot of storytelling work through an emerging AV company called Atikan. Michelle, based in Maine. Michelle is a queer organizer who for 30 years has been both elevating the stories of incarcerated people, unhoused people, low-wage people, people who use drugs, and thinking about the ethics of that through academia and movement spaces and campaigns, and also has been telling her own story as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse and psychiatric incarceration. Fariha Tayyab, artist, visual storyteller, multidisciplinary, and a facilitator. She has a lot of photo and video work experience, and her creative work, reporting, and content creation focus on identity, liberation, and equity. That's who's in the room. So we would love to hear a little bit from you all just to know who's in the room. We have a Mentimeter poll that we're going to share in a second. And the question is, what is your relationship to storytelling? And this will just help us understand who's in the room. So to make sure I get the tech right, is someone going to put the link to the Mentimeter in the chat, or should I go to the previous slide?
Yep, we got it.
Okay. So the link to the Mentimeter should be in the chat. If you are having any issues, please feel free to raise your hand or chat with Ariana. And once those start coming in, I'll share my screen so we can see a little bit about who's in the room. And while we're waiting for those to roll in, again, the question is, what is the relationship to storytelling? I'm going to just give a brief overview of the agenda so people know what to expect. So keep responding to that poll as you roll in. So a little bit about today's agenda. Michelle's going to kick us off with some guiding questions. The questions are not ones we will just answer. This session is intended to raise considerations and approaches and to get people to start thinking about ways perhaps that we hadn't thought about before that ethics are involved in storytelling. So these are guiding questions that frame the whole session and also give you some ideas of what to ask yourself. Then we will get a little more concrete into process, and we've broken this section up into conversations about consent, which Michelle will facilitate, story collection and interviewing really tactically, that will be Fariha and Frederic. And then I will wrap us up by talking about framing and editing, so how we actually shape and produce those stories, different options for how to do so. Then we will have breakout groups. That's really a place where we know so many of you in the room have a lot to say, so we hope that you will share in those spaces. We'll have some prompts for groups. We'll assign you into 3 random groups, each with one of us as a facilitator. If you are someone who prefers to process by quietly journaling or writing or reflecting, you don't need to join one of the breakout groups. You can just stay in this main room with Ariana, and you can keep your camera on or off and do some reflecting. Those breakout groups will have a note taker who will try to synthesize 1 or 2 main points from that group. We will come back together. We'll hear a little bit about what groups talked about, and we will wrap up and offer next steps. As I said, this session is really just beginning a conversation. There's so much that we could say in so many different directions we could take this topic, so we wanted this to be kind of an overview. So we hope that this inspires possibly future sessions and future conversations. Okay, so probably we have some of the Mentimeter results pouring in, so hopefully they will start showing up. Great. So we asked, what is your connection to storytelling? I'll just slowly scroll through. We have comms directors. We have people talking about water access, training and coaching others in better storytelling. Comms director and marginalized Asian, Southeast Asian voices, visual storyteller, former folklorist, social change actors telling stories through a podcast, collective liberation, story producer, design work, moth style storytelling. I think I know who this one is. Organizing young people in Georgia. Awesome. Film and TV. Daughter of a cab driver. Storytelling for tips. TV. Stories that aid understanding of health inequities. Passion is storytelling. Grant writing. Eavesdropping on my parents' stories. This is very cool. Okay. Here, I'll scroll a little more slowly through the last one since I can't read them all. Amazing, amazing, amazing. Okay. I think I'm ready to hand it over to Michelle, who is going to be kicking us off with some conversations about consent. And we will definitely keep all these Mentimeter results, so you can feel free to keep chatting them as well.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Hi, this is Michelle. It's kind of an overwhelming group. We never counted on 105 of you in this room, but we are so delighted you are here. I am first trained as a Freudian pedagogist, so I actually believe you all have the answers. And so I'm going to move us through pretty quickly to get through my part to get us to breakout rooms. So we framed some guiding questions, not expansive, right? But thinking about, what are your goals? What are your intentions of this story? And who defined the goals, right? A lot of us always ask that question, who's not at the table? Which I think is a really important question to always ask. How does your position or role impact your approach to storytelling? Does your storytelling practice reinforce or deconstruct, or somewhere in between, a predominant narrative? And are you lifting up humanity or resilience? And I always ask, are you complicating narratives? Are you holding complexity? Like, if people know me, I am saying over and over again, I hold a lot of complexity, but I'm also asking other people to do that. And feel free to put in the chat other things, yes, as in Paulo Freire, other things that you might be asking yourselves, to other questions that you might find helpful in your storytelling. Next slide. So Voice of Witness, which is a well-known organization in this space. I've attended at least one of their trainings. These principles are both on the RadComs website, and we will send them out after. We will, so I'm not going to read them. And we're just going to move on to the next slide, where I'm going to talk a little bit about consent and what it means to consent to tell a story, or some of the things that can mean. Next slide. So I found this definition that I think is really good, or this kind of intro. It is not the form, right? Consent is not the release form to have someone tell a story, or to share their photo, or to share a video. That is not where it starts or where it ends. And I think if we all start with that question of, are we using that as a form of consent that can like lead us to a whole bunch of other more complicated and complex questions. Next slide. So this is for me something that I've been thinking about and don't have answers to recently, like over the past, I would say 6 months, which is proximity to story. And in addition to like being a longtime organizer, I have an MBA and PhD. I'm a non-practicing critical management scholar. I say non-practicing and always practicing. But I think there are ways, so I've drawn 2 circles, and, you know, we talk about always centering the narrator of our story. And I think there are ways in which many of us have some intersecting identities with the people with whom we partner and tell stories. And I know from doing that can make it possible for people to share more with us and for us to have intimate and ongoing relationships with those who tell us stories. With that said, I will say that I'm an anti-capitalist, and I think that if we aren't in late stage capitalism, we are pretty close. And so when money is exchanged, and if people's material needs aren't met, that includes our own and the people telling stories, I think there's a complication with consent. If we are being employed and our only way to pay rent, to get food, to I'm in Maine now without a working car, like to have the things we need to survive is through storytelling, that's problematic if our basic needs or the narrator's basic needs aren't being met. So I think like understanding that context is really important. People use the word accountability a lot, and it makes me cringe because I sort of came up where that word was used in K through 12 education, and it mainly applied to Black young men, and it was punishment. Like it was not about transformative justice. But I think as those of us who have relatively more power, we do need to think about who are we in community with, right? I think we now have these new challenges that have been named so well in elite capture. And, you know, they were sort of the N=1 or a single story, but like now thinking about how and I am that person who's been like carrying around the Combahee River Collective since like 1992, but how have elites captured identity politics to misrepresent the left? And how can that happen in story? And is story when is story the right or not right time to counter that? And then, you know, we talk about trauma informed, but for those of us, depending on where we are in this circle, also needing to think about secondary trauma and how that might impact us. Next slide. So I found WaterAid's policies around consent, and I don't know if there's anyone in here from WaterAid, but they have, I think, some of the best updated policies that I will say, especially in regards to children. As someone who does some fundraising as part of her consulting and practice, it's pretty amazing, and I think it can largely apply, but I think some really big takeaways are for me are consent should be able to be withdrawn. So if you're working for an organization, like you need to know things like what are the policies around, you know, how long you keep a story, like does the person know how they withdraw a story? Like, what does that look like? Our stories as people aren't stagnant, right? Like, I could end up moving to a state where I kind of am in a state that's not so great, to kind of county by county. And that wasn't a choice. It was a dislocation. I didn't move. I was, I couldn't afford to be in Massachusetts anymore. So like, we need to know things aren't stagnant when people are telling stories, and we need to make sure that consent is really informed. And tech is also moving really, really fast. And I have started to research AI. I don't really know like the impact of it. My colleague, Frederic, is gonna share an example of consent. I'm gonna turn it over to him.
Okay, so I was talking about an example I was going to share with you. We were working with a local NGO, which was working on women literacy. Okay, thank you. Which was working on women literacy. So we reached a point where, thank you, we reached a point where we're supposed to now proceed with a story telling. I mean, the stories of the women, which were part of the program, the literacy program. And the organization came to us with videos, with some information about the women. So so that we can now start building the story and go ahead and use it. So what we came up with were some questions like, did you get the consent of these women? I mean, did they know? I mean, did you explain that this information and also the videos, the pictures will be used across social media, across different networks? I mean, is there any like written form, or is there anything we can verify on that they gave the consent for these videos to be used in different conditions? They were not able to respond, and obviously they took it as something for granted. Like, if the women are part of the program, it means that these women consent for the story, I mean, for the information or for the videos to be published anywhere. So we're like, no, it doesn't work like that. Even if they are part of your program, when it comes to storytelling, you should make sure that you ask them and you get the consent fully and clearly before going ahead. So I just wanted to share this example of consent, good practice of consent, which we had in the past. And yeah, I will pass it now to Fariha.
All right, I'm also happy to talk a little bit about consent. I'm really appreciative of both Frederic and Vishal in this regards. I do think that consent is comprehensive, and maybe cumulative is a better word, but like, I have been in situations where somebody has been interested to have a dialogue, an interview, and then revoked it like after the interview happened. And even though my intention was like, if this story doesn't come to light, then people don't know the levels of like oppression we have like right here in our neighborhood. I knew that me pushing this individual would like come into a situation where it was like a repetition of oppression, and also like reinforcing systems of like colonial frameworks that we don't really agree with, or I don't really agree with. And I've been in situations where I've had to cancel like entire projects. I relocated from the Midwest to Houston just like very recently, and I wanted to do a story on how we have a crisis in the city and in the nation, where it's not just a police explicit bias against, African American and Black men from the diaspora, but also like Black people in general. And I had women who wanted to share their story, women and non-gender conforming people who want to share their story, because I wanted to get their stories out, but they had so much angst about what the impact would be of that, who would be after them, or they didn't want to even repeat it to me, even if I was somebody that they trusted through a second contact. I mean, there's even somebody on here actually that I wanted to talk to, and because we had a close relationship prior, it was a conflict of interest, but people weren't willing to share their story. And even though I felt like it was really critical, like, what is my role in this movement of liberation as an Asian American second gen woman transplant to the Midwest? Like, how do I honor this challenge that we have while also understanding that like humans and these people and their stories are sacred? And I'm not going to reiterate things that were done to me by reinforcing like structures of oppression and such. So I definitely think that this is a really important conversation. I know Frederic and I will be touching more into it as we go along, and we can definitely talk about it in the breakout, but I do believe consent is comprehensive and you have to understand it. Are we approaching the conversation through a horizontal lens, or are we indirectly coercing this person because we come from powers, like a higher power of intellect or race or socioeconomics, like all of those things, right? Like, what is the power play? Am I building relationship and community with you, or am I trying to use your story for my own gain, right? Or what I think is better for you. So I think we really need to understand like the relationship part, which I'm happy to touch on as we continue kind of this dialogue. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I think at this level, I have to also share with you some key principles, which I believe all storytellers should keep in mind when collecting or telling stories. Let's say I also found some of these ideas in a storytelling guidebook, which is mentioned. So you will find the source of these ideas. We send this to you. I think when you are collecting a story or when you want to tell a story, make sure that you put in mind that the story is not yours. The story is from someone else. So be very open and also be very flexible when you are collecting stories. The second point, which I think is very important, is that we collect stories, we tell stories to bring positive change. And while we are collecting stories, we should make sure that finally we don't harm the contributors to of the story. So it's very important that we always make some risk assessments. We are able to stop or postpone at any time the participation of the contributor, even if we know that the story will be a success. With the story will be maybe it will be something very successful. We should make sure that we be able to postpone or stop at any time the participation of a contributor if the person is not in a safe space. The very last point, which I also think we should prioritize, is to be empathetic. So it's very important because sometimes even when you are collecting the stories, of course, you have an objective to achieve, but also make sure that if it was you at the place of the contributor, how will you feel? So put yourself in the shoe of the contributor, but also prioritize the safety of the person, of the contributor or the contributors. Make sure that their rights are respected, and make sure that the stories you are collecting will contribute to the empowerment instead of maybe harming them later. So this is what I wanted to share with you concerning the key principles we could keep in mind when we are collecting stories.
Thank you, Frederic. I didn't realize we were already at this section. Can we just go, yeah, right here. So I think I just want to touch on these points that I may not have expounded on. And I know Frederic and I, when we were having a dialogue, and we can come back to this, is like, even when it comes to like consent and quote unquote leadership or initiative, I don't like the word leadership because it can to some extent reinforce power play, but like, where are you meeting folks? Like, are you just coming to their house? Like, do you have, like, what makes you think you can just come to their house? Like, are they the ones deciding where to meet, where it's comfortable? And I think all of those smaller pieces reiterate that, like, what is your intent? Is your intent to establish trust, build community, and work on relationships? And if you notice, like, even when it comes to reporting work or work around like sharing stories for annual reports or storytelling campaigns, like, the people that are trusted are like the ones doing the work. And so if I just showed up yesterday, like nobody's going to share their story with me, and whoever shares it might not be as authentic as another story. Should I have been more involved in that neighborhood, even if it's not like my neighborhood where I grew up or the neighborhood where I live? Like, what work am I doing in these communities? And I shouldn't be doing the work to establish trust. I should be doing all of the work I do with like the same core values of my life. Like, what is our role in society as community builders? That's what I ask myself. Like, what is my role as somebody who has like the option to capture on camera and with the pen? Like, what is my role and responsibility? And is this person understanding that I'm offering them a way to use their story and tie it to like the skill set I have, and then go through this journey with them? And I've been told, you know, before by editors, like, we don't need to have like the source when it comes to, like, for example, reporting, like, work in this realm of like approving. But I'm like, no, but they weren't going to be anybody else's source. So if they don't approve, then like I have to go back, because it all goes to consent. And so, you know, I sometimes think we have to like decolonize the ways in which we operate, and then question like the work that we do every day. You know, it's not my role and responsibility to critique and question everybody else, because I have enough to focus on my own. And I think that's how like we create like ripple effects. And I think also how people see that you're really genuine. So I think I mentioned the horizontal approach, like what relationships do you already have with community? And definitely want to talk about trauma. Michelle referred to trauma, but like, is the story that I'm talking about with a client, if I'm working with a human trafficking organization, survivors of human trafficking, or even people who are still stuck in this oppressive lifestyle, like by means of coercion, right, from society and individuals, what is, like, how do I tell that story without them having fear, but also like shame? And there's so many critical aspects, and I'm not a social worker and I'm not a therapist, but I am very trauma like nerded out when it comes to like understanding trauma, because I think it's really critical to so much of the work we do. And the more trauma informed we can be, the more trauma based approach we can have. So it's not just like trauma informed, it's like having humility, cultural humility, awareness, and always coming from this point of like, I might not know what's best in this situation. So if things change, like, this is this person's story, there's an automatic copyright on it. I don't own anything. It's their life. And I think if we come to it with this understanding that their response, whether it's like unappealing to you or disrespectful to you, is not really about you, other than the lack of like awareness you have in your own mind about like what trauma response they're having, right? Like if somebody's bitter or super enthusiastic or whatever it is, right? Even if somebody really wants to be on quote unquote camera, like that's not a reason to judge them, because maybe they don't have a sense of belonging, or maybe they want to do liberation by helping other people understand their struggle. So I think there's a lot of ways to approach trauma, and I could talk about this for like 9 years and I still would feel unequipped. But I definitely think understanding how this operates and constantly like growing as a person is really critical to any kind of storytelling work you do. So yeah, I'll pass it back to Frederic or Michelle if they want to add anything before we continue to kind of move along and such.
Okay, thank you, Fariha. Please go ahead.
I'll just quickly add that I've been doing a lot of learning and peer support spaces, and I will say that that learning also informs some of my learning about storytelling, that being in 2 different communities focusing on decarcerating mental health care has really helped me understand power in a different way. And a lot of what we were talking about, you know, horizontal storytelling is really about power and recognizing how much power there is.
Frederic, did you want to add something?
Not on this one. I think we could proceed to the next slide around the selection of the location and the medium. That's why I have a few things to say. The next one. No, you're going back. I think the slide after is this slide 14. Yeah, so here we are. Very important also when it comes to storytelling, the location. But on my side, from my experience, I think in terms of location, it varies from one contributor to another. So for me, the most important is to make sure that where we are hosting the interview or where we are running the different storytelling processes, we make sure that the place or the space is safe for the contributor, because I think the contributor, the safety of the contributor should be very paramount in the storytelling process. So for me, it really doesn't matter, but we should just make sure that the place is very safe for the contributor. Me, in my case, I use most of the time a studio, and also, let's say, on the fields, like when we go to the community, we we host the different interviews in the community, in the house, or anywhere. But I know that some of you have other experiences which about the location. Talking now about the medium. For the medium, what I know right now is through video, audio, photography, and written format. So what I do personally is audio and video. So I do audio and video for story telling. But I would really love to start now doing photographies, because for me, photography, let's say, clearly sometimes vehicle the message at some point. So I will try to see if I can now start doing photographies to tell story. But for the time, it is about, I use video and audio. An example of audio, because I really love that. For me, when we use audio, it protects the contributor, because it's a bit difficult to identify visually the person. So it protects the contributor if it is in a context which we know that it is not, in maybe context which is a bit difficult for the contributor. So using audio could be helpful to collect and tell the stories. So beyond the protection of the contributor, it's also build, let's say, the confidence and of the contributors. Some people are very shy or cannot speak in front of a camera. But I think if it is audio, if it is like a remote audio, like podcast, or even if we just put a mic there for them to speak in without putting a camera on them, I think sometimes they are able to say easily what they want and what they have on the heart. So that's why most of the time I prefer working with audio. So I think I finished. Yeah, so I think this is what I can say about the selection of the location and the medium. If maybe Fariha will jump in and talk about compositing storytellers.
Thank you, Frederic. This is like, Michelle talked about this a little bit. Somebody actually asked me this on a listserv, or asked on the listserv, and I have come across this question multiple times. Money is like so transactional, but it's also so necessary to survive. And I don't have a clear answer, because I don't think there is a clear answer. And I think it depends on the situation. And I realize maybe that's not what folks are looking for. But like, if I'm writing stories about people in a different lifestyle than me, right? And they don't necessarily do the same storytelling work I do, and this is a great relationship. Like, if they're taking time out from their daily survival, like, why would they do that? If you're not if they don't have all this extra level of cushion where they can comfortably leave their job for 2 hours and talk to you and not have repercussions, or have childcare, or meet you in a place, or transportation, like all those certain factors of mobility, like economic and otherwise, aren't there, then like why would they talk to you and you just expect them to? Like, it goes back to this power play that we've all been mentioning. And so I think it's a case by case basis. And I'm very curious to hear other folks in this space, in this Zoom space's thoughts, because I do think it's like, I've heard multiple things. I've heard people really push for it. And then I've heard of people say like, well, like, a lot of other things on the we don't like money side. And of course, I encourage people like to barter if you're not able to like compensate if you have funds or something. You know, like, but I've heard of people being like, hey, I'll give you $100 and you can put it towards your rent. Like, so there's a lot of opportunities, I think, to explore. And I think it's critical to understand who you're dealing with, and how you're dealing with them, and how are you honoring their time, right? Because we just say thank you for your time, like what does that mean? And I've had people, panelists mention when I've been in conferences, like somebody was like, oh, you're not going to pay me. And they said they were so humiliated because they didn't even have that conversation up front, right? And again, like up front doesn't mean like the first time you meet them, like, hey, I'm this and this person, I'm working with this and this agency, or I do this level of street reporting or whatever it is. But I think it's like before the interviewing or whatever interaction happens, I think that conversation is critical. And there's a way to bring it up gently. So I'll definitely kind of allow other folks to talk, both in my panel and anybody else in the space. So.
Yeah, thanks for kicking that off. So I have a lot of thoughts about compensating people. One, I'll try to summarize. So one is, I agree with Fariha that you should get clear about it and make sure the person is comfortable before you kick off an interview, and make it clear that they can say no or push back, like frame it as a question. Like, I'm able to give you a $200 gift card to Amazon. Like, would that work? Making it a negotiation. I have done a lot of coaching work around helping people write and publish op-eds, where they may not have previously had experience with that genre, but they feel like an op-ed in a certain outlet will help their story reach wider audiences, in which case I think about how much should they get paid, knowing that a lot of outlets pay writers not enough. So even if the outlet is going to pay that writer, generally the amount of time they spend on it, that $100 or $200 is a drop in the bucket based on the number of hours they may have been drafting and working with me. So I typically, if the outlet pays them, I'm also paying them more. And I try to think about it in terms of just an hourly rate of how much time I spent with them. Another thing, and I appreciate Michelle for having pointed us to this resource from the Soul Center for Liberated Work. So paying people has implications for them. So number one, if you pay them, I believe over like $600 in a year, someone has to report it on their taxes, at least legally. Whether they do so or not is not necessarily your issue, but especially when you're working with minors or low wage people, I think it's important to make sure that they're aware of that. And if the money you're giving them is going to cause tax implications for them, can you help them with that, or help point them in the direction of someone who can help them with that, so that you're not inadvertently getting them into some kind of tax trouble? One way I've avoided that is by paying people in installments and making sure that they know, and it's in writing, that you will pay them the rest, but that, you know, you're doing it so that they don't have to report it on their taxes. And then just asking people, especially people in rural areas where they may not have a lot of stores or commercial, hold on, let me mute my mom texting me. They may not have a lot of commercial areas near them. And so they actually would prefer online shopping. And I personally don't shop at Amazon at all, but that's not my place to put that value on other people. So someone in a rural area, Amazon is going to meet all their needs, or Walmart's going to meet all their needs, and they want a gift card. Or some people want an Uber or a Lyft gift card. If you're in a nonprofit or some kind of formal organization, you guys might get credit card points from your business account, and you can use those to just get gift cards for people. And I think the compensation question also really comes up because, you know, saying, oh, you'll get exposure, or your story will impact change, or you'll get heard, that's not enough. That's That's like telling a writer, oh, we're not going to pay you, but you're going to get exposure. Like that's exploitative, especially people who have told their traumas over and over and over again. And I'm thinking of youth in foster care specifically, who are sent to hearings or fundraisers or whatever over and over again, and they've had to relive some of the worst moments of their life and see nothing change. And that is horrible. So really making sure that somebody is paid for their time equal to, if possible, the amount that you're being paid for your time working with them if you're in a formal employment situation. A couple more quick thoughts. I don't want to hog the room on this one, but please track who you've spoken to, especially if you're on a team. I can't tell you the number of times that, and I take full responsibility for this, reaching out to someone and finding out that a colleague has already spoken to them. And it's really disrespectful of their time and yeah, just disrespectful. So I think admin really matters. How are you tracking who you've spoken to? Where are those files stored? Making sure those files, getting support from your IT team or your data security folks around where those files stored, who has access to them, and making sure that they are not in some Google folder that's owned by one colleague, and when they quit, all of that leaves, and now you're going to be bothering the same people again who you've already interviewed. So where you store files, I think, is really important, especially if people say their full legal name or their state or whatever on the story. Like, you have a real responsibility to protect their safety. And last, I just wanted to say around location, there's really no one size fits all answer. Again, I think as a story collector, you have to let go of control. And if you are not willing to let go of control, then there's already a power dynamic inherent in it. And so it needs to be a negotiation. Ask them where they want to meet and how much, is this amount that I can pay you enough? And it's going to vary. Like when I was working with foster youth and they were maybe in a group home and they wanted to criticize the foster care system, that was not the ideal place for them to do it. But as young people or people who were on some kind of, they didn't have freedom of movement, they couldn't just drive or get on a bus. So sometimes it was meeting them at their place where they live, but a park across the street. And so just really like presenting a range of options. And like Frederic said, sometimes audio is the way to do it if they need privacy. Libraries, public parks. I generally think somebody's home can create a power dynamic if they are in a very different class situation than the story collector. So offering to host people, I like Frederic's suggestion of a studio. If you or your organization has a space, it can feel neutral or it can feel loaded if you like are in some really fancy building or whatever. I will stop there and see if anyone else in our group has things to add about collection and interviewing.
I think we're good, Tanya. I've been going at it in the chat, so.
Great. Yeah, thank you for engaging in the chat. Since I'm sharing my screen, I'm not paying attention to it, but yes, everyone in the room, please feel free to keep putting stuff in the chat and thoughtful stuff also save for the breakouts because we really want to hear it. Okay, I'm going to shift us to editing. Oh, and sorry, went to the wrong place. I just wanted to call out around payment. The other thing with people on a fixed income or, oh my God, I keep jumping ahead, sorry, is that getting paid a certain amount may make them ineligible for benefits. So again, there's a lot to consider. So once we're thinking about, okay, we've collected audio, video, photo, text, whatever. How do you actually want to present it to the world, and what are you going to say about it? Like, what are the themes that you're elevating? How are you going to describe it? When you promote your video on social media or in a newsletter or wherever, how are you describing it to people to encourage them to view it? This idea of asset-based language or asset-based framing versus deficit-based framing, we could do a whole session on that, so I'm not going to go deeply into it, but I encourage people to look it up if you're not familiar with the concept. But in short, deficit-based framing focuses on what people don't have or how they are being harmed, whereas asset-based focuses on people's resourcefulness, resilience, things like that. So one very brief example is an organization I volunteer with used to describe people as trapped in poverty or having low literacy or being functionally illiterate, and now says things like beginning readers or supporting a family on low wages. So just being mindful about language. Obviously, there's all kinds of, style guides and checklists you can use around word choice, but beyond word choice, how are you literally packaging the stories and saying what they're about? Can you uplift people's strengths? And then someone in our early brainstorming around planning this session brought up the idea of rejecting a traditional story arc of some kind of like challenge and resolution. So many of the people, everybody, right? Like, we're still living in various overlapping crises, and it can be disingenuous and or harmful to depict things as having been solved or finished, especially if you're claiming that you as an organizer or the organization that you work with is the one that solved their problem as a way to try to fundraise for your organization, where that person may still be living in the challenges that they described. So harm reduction just acknowledges a more approach of, making folks' lives better while continuing the choices and the freedom to make choices that they have. And then also I've heard some people talk about what's called a heroine's journey. There's some kind of gender essentialism there around like femininity, but it just does acknowledge this idea that there's not always a resolution, and that transformation sometimes is more internal than external. So I encourage people to check that out. I want to get concretely into editing. So I primarily come, or almost exclusively come, from the world of written storytelling, but as an editor, I've done a lot of work with animation, film, photography, portrait photography, things like that. So you really need to tailor the editing to the circumstance. There's no one size fits all. So for example, I've done a lot of storytelling where I'm coaching the person to tell the story, and then it'll be published under their name. Like I mentioned, I've coached people to write and publish op-eds. And I'll show an example in a minute where I helped a young poet get their poetry published. So their poems kind of already existed, but then I helped frame them by doing a Q&A with the poet to kind of accompany the poetry. In all of those circumstances, there were many phone calls with those people, either drafting, conversations, editing, doing live track changes where they could see suggestions and consent to it. But I made sure they understood in advance that, hey, this could take 3 to 5 30-minute phone calls between you and me to do this. Do you have that kind of time? Are you comfortable with it? If they weren't, okay, let's think of a different thing that we could do based on the time that you have. And then, like I said, compensating them for that time and thinking about that. If someone is like at an event and you're just collecting the story then and there, most likely they're not going to be involved that much in the editing process, but just making it clear and making it explicit to them, like, do you need to see this again? I think that this is not journalism, or at least not traditional journalism, at least what I'm talking about here. So it's fine to edit more than you would under the official tenets of traditional journalism, but that does not mean that you can be fast and loose with people's language, because sometimes the way they said it is just as important as what they said. And injecting your editing style can diminish it, even if you're like, oh, well, that's grammatically incorrect, or that's not how we say it in English. I think there's a lot of considerations that can be made around captioning. And I recommend people work with professional captioners whenever possible. And I'm happy if people need to recommend some rather than automatic captioning, because it's just so many errors can come up, especially when someone's first language is not English, or they may speak in a way that AI thinks is incorrect. Rounds of review make more work for the storyteller, but I typically prefer it because it really encourages them to spend time with their own story. And over time, they may realize, you know what, actually, I don't want to say that, or that's not how I want to say that. And so slowing the process down means that you are spending more time and money, and likely they deserve more money. But I think in the end, it's really important. And one of my former colleagues, Haley Corman, has this principle around like they should think fondly of the experience of working with you, like 5 minutes after it's over, 5 hours after it's over, 5 months after it's over. Like it should be positive. And if it's not, like most likely you shouldn't be using that story. We could also do a whole session on accessibility. And again, I won't go into that, but I think making sure that stories, even if you capture it in one medium, the way you present it allows people to engage with it in different ways. Captions, ASL interpretation, interpretation in multiple languages simultaneously if you have a multilingual audience, things like that. Okay, I'm just gonna spend a minute sharing a couple examples. Maybe we'll show one or two. So on the left here, we have stories that are composites, by which I mean interviews were conducted with real people, but for whatever reason, their safety or their availability to be published was limited. So with real details of real people's lives, different stories were told, but the characters had new names and may have been merging different experiences from different people, but to present what could be the real experience of a youth in foster care or someone who's making the transition from high school to college. So at the top is Rigged. I encourage you to check it out on your own time. It's actually a web-based game. And so you're presented with scenarios where someone who's on parole is said, if you don't take this math test, you're not going to finish 7th grade. But at the same time, if you don't meet with your parole officer right now, you're going to be incarcerated again. And so you're presented with sort of impossible choices that real young people have been presented with. And you kind of, it's like a choose your own type thing. So using stories to build empathy in an anonymous way through games. The video below it is another example where it was turned into a kind of a trailer with an animator. So talks about Anna, who, had to stop out of high school to support her family when her mom got COVID. Again, like these are details from real people's stories merged into one. And then animation can be a great way because we know video performs so well on the internet, but if you had only the audio or only the stories, then you can animate it. On the right here, we have an op-ed with a young poet and activist that I coached to publish her own op-ed. So again, in this case, the story collection was actually writing coaching for the most part, and making sure that she was comfortable with how it ultimately appeared, and then making sure that she not only was paid, but was able to utilize the story for her own professional development. So is it in her portfolio? Things like that. And then last is the poetry that I mentioned. It's actually in a literary magazine. So just thinking about non-traditional outlets for our work. I shared with this young poet a few different literary magazines, and I'm like, which one would you be most proud to be published in? So this young person, we used a first name only, and the poetry was published as is. There was no, I did not edit the poems at all. And the way we put it in context was a Q&A between me and the person. I will just say that in terms of one of the things we talked about ongoing consent, if you're in an organization and you're putting these things online, one point that is an opportunity to consider getting consent again or thinking about it is when you have like web domain or web hosting renewals. I know this is like a really tactical thing, but so often if you build a campaign and then you forget it exists and the site goes down, and some person who told you a story was like sharing that story with people a lot and was really proud of it, and then the site goes down and it disappears and all their work is gone. So I think just be really mindful of maintaining these things and making sure that they exist online or wherever they exist, and that you're funding and repaying the web fees so that they continue to exist. Okay. We're gonna move to breakouts. I know we just shared a lot, and like I said, these are all just considerations. So we hope you'll go deeper into them in your breakouts. We would love folks to do another Mentimeter if you're comfortable. Sorry. And the question is, what is one item you can take with you and implement in the next week, in the next month? Sometimes I find it helpful to really put some time-bound and measurable goals around it. So the Mentimeter link is at the top of the slide. We welcome you to just go type in some responses. In the meantime, just looking at the clock, I would love if people who were in the breakouts and took any notes, if you want to unmute note takers or people who volunteered to share out, do you want to unmute and let us know if anything worth sharing with the wider group came up in your session?
Yeah, I can speak to my group, and then, you know, somebody can jump in if I'm not doing the best job at rehashing it. But I thought it was really interesting. We picked up on a thread that had come up in the chat, and this was, again, like tensions around how and if to compensate speakers for their sort of singular stories, and whether, you know, the fact that these people might not have many economic options outside of that, does that make the relationship necessarily coercive? And certain ways that people get around this. So we had someone share that, you know, with their organization, sometimes they consider other ways to compensate speakers that are outside of just pay. And we had another member of our group kind of follow up on this and point us again towards like, what are some long-term opportunities that aren't just sort of short-term, you get $50 for this instance? Like maybe that can look like offering fellowships, offering travel, like making it clear to them that they are now part of a larger network, and that you're going to basically, you know, you're going to keep them with you. And I think that really vibes with something that was said earlier, which is like, it's about building relationships and it's about long-term change versus sort of individual transactions that feel extractive. And then this last thought came up at the end that was about the right to be forgotten, especially when the internet exists. And that makes me think about, like, when we share stories, like, what is the afterlife of those stories? Do we necessarily control, like, who gets to pick them up and where? And so respecting that storytellers are making themselves vulnerable in a way, and to be kind of protective of that.
Thanks. I love that afterlife of stories. Any other breakout group? We just have a couple minutes left. Want to share out?
Yeah, I can share. Sorry, I don't have my screen on. But yeah, in our group, I I had shared, I think, a specific concern of mine, which is I think after the interview process is over, sometimes there is like I think a wish, I think at least on my end, like on how to better, I guess, include or invite the the persons whose story it is, invite them into the editing process. And some people were very frank. It's like some people just aren't interested, right? They don't want to kind of review their own story. They don't want to dwell on it, or perhaps they feel like that's their contribution, just like the telling of their story, and they really don't need to be involved further. And then sometimes I think you also need to have an honest conversation as part of relationship building as to like how they are feeling in the moment, like, and then like checking in with them, I think, on like how I think what I guess this will, whatever, how the final form of their story, like what that will look like, and if they have any other, like, I guess, like concerns or ideas about it. And I think another question that was brought up by Frederic, thank you, which was like, at what point of the storytelling process do I think storytellers or communicators often like miss out on like something important? And so I think Lucas from my group he made a really great point about, I think there's a difference between being asked to do something and then being invited. And sometimes I think the invitation of like being part of something bigger, or perhaps like, making this a collective effort can really do a lot. So I think bring people in more. So I thought those were all both very helpful insights. Thank you, everyone in my group.
Thank you, Lauren. We have like another 30 to 60 seconds if somebody in the third breakout group wants to share, and then we'll close it out. And thank you, those Lauren and then the former person from the group who shared.
I failed to assign a note taker in my group, so I took some notes. We talked about the challenges of trust and consent and relationships if you are perhaps a national organization or a network or a coalition and you don't have the local relationships. And one person asked the question, why don't you have those relationships? And if so, does that mean that that's somewhere to invest in staff or more formal partnerships? Another person shared this idea of story of self. I think someone mentioned that again in the Mentimeter, just around actually offering storytelling training to people rather than necessarily just asking them to share, so that they can do it themselves and or reach back out when they're ready, so that you're investing in community building skills. And that becomes one way to initiate the conversation in not a transactional way, and then people can do with that skill what they will. We also talked about scope creep. So if you use something and then suddenly you're also putting it in your newsletter and it becomes a permanent asset on your website, just like making sure that people know that's a possibility and getting their consent. If their preferences or how they tell their story, they might change their mind. We talked about language around trans and gender nonconforming identities changing, so the way that someone said it, they may now no longer feel comfortable with. And finally, just asking organizations to slow down and do this work more slowly.